First of all, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This is a bit of a milestone for me. This is episode 100. Church Public has been a labor of love for me, and I will continue to proclaim the light to a dark culture as long as God allows me to do so. My name is Matt Odegaard, and this is Church Public. Well, again, welcome back to Church Public. I appreciate you tuning in, whether you are listening on audio or whether you are watching on video. I certainly appreciate it. If you haven't already, you can go to churchpublic.com where you can watch the videos. You can grab some of the audio podcasts. You can subscribe at Apple Music, at Google, at Spotify, pretty much anywhere you grab your podcasts these days. And you can also check us out at all of the socials, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, at Church Public. Thanks for being with us. If you do feel like supporting, you can go to churchpublic.com/support. All right, so I just want to talk about today that Christianity really is under fire. We are living in, especially in America, even more especially some of Europe and Western Europe and beyond towards the East, Christianity is under fire, and it has been obviously for 2,000 years. Christianity has rarely been the mainstream. We've had a specifically and really very special couple of centuries here in America where Christianity has been accepted. By and large, Christianity now is not accepted. It's not accepted very much in America. Yes, of course, there are big pockets of America that are still culturally Christian, but those that are really just in power in America in almost every aspect, in terms of government, in terms of media, in terms of academia, are just flat out kind of against Christianity, against God. And America has been hailed as, really even built as, this based on Judeo-Christian, combination really of Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman values put together. And this is how it was really just created as a country. And the morality of this American form of government, this self-government, it was based on biblical values. People may argue against this, but it is inherently true. The founders themselves said over and over again in letters, in the founding documents, all over the place, that this self-government has to be based on biblical values, even specifically and intentionally the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the foundation for the rule of law in most of the legislation that was originally written and processed into being for America. And many of the founders expressly stated, if we don't have these values of the Bible undergirding, right, supporting, founding our country and our individual character, if we don't have these values in our individual character, right, this virtue, this idea of virtue that goes all the way back to Aristotle, but that's the Greco-Roman and biblical combination. We combined these things in founding America. If we don't have this idea of character, this idea of virtue, and a basis on biblical values, then this form of government cannot stand. Many of the founders have stated this outrightly. And this is bearing out to be true. We see this throughout the last century and beyond. We have abandoned God personally. And I'm not talking about being a Christian nation because this is a new derogatory term, Christian nationalism, right? I'm not really even talking about that. I'm not talking about making God the center of our politics. I'm talking about individually following God as a foundation for morality that allows self-government. All of the founders, many of them expressly said things like, if you don't have a virtuous character, if you don't have a character that is built on biblical values so that you think and do the right things, then as an individual, you will not think and do the right things. And therefore, as a community, as a society, you can't exist, because all of a sudden your morality, your character, and thereby an extension your laws that you build on this are not based on any foundation that is measurable. That is why we get to where we are, where it's you be you, live your truth, find your truth, do whatever you want to do that makes you happy, pursue your happiness. But ultimately this, and we've talked about this many times on the show, you can't all exist in a community where you all are pursuing different goals. And I don't mean like in business goals. I mean, if your character is based on some foundation that you invented, and the person next to you's character is based on a foundation they invented, and those intersect, all of a sudden you have conflict and issues, and no way to resolve that conflict and issues because you've both created your own moral worldview, and there's no foundation to compare it to. It's only based on your feelings. That just can't work on large scale. It can't work. And that's what we're seeing play out in real time, where all these different value systems, even the far left's value systems, are crashing in on each other because they can't exist in the same place at the same time. So this is what we have unfortunately lost in this country, and we're scrambling as a society now to legislate. Because as I mentioned, and this is just a reality. You can check my work. You can go and read the founders. You can read why they created this rule of law and how they created it, based on, by and large, the Ten Commandments. So now we're scrambling as a society because we've removed the idea of God. We've removed the idea of a morality that you can base on something outside of yourself. Now we're scrambling as a society to legislate, to make laws to guide our morality. And so we have this weird statement that almost everybody on all sides is trying to repeat, to remove God. And it's the separation of church and state. And just as an aside, if you didn't know, this is not in the Constitution. The separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. You don't have to believe me. You can go and read the Constitution. It's not a very long read. You could read it today if you wanted to. And the phrase or even the idea is not in there. In fact, over and over again, the founders championed the idea of faith in culture, not secularism, not atheism, not even deism, faith in the God of the Bible. And they even had arguments about this. There were deists. This is true. There were deists that didn't want to believe specifically in the God of the Bible, or that God had kind of dropped off everybody on the planet and then kind of like backed off and said, okay, now I'm not interested in you guys anymore, so you do whatever you want. A very simple, oversimplified explanation of deism. But there were arguments by the founders, and the side that prevailed, I believe correctly, is that that's not how God operates. And as a society and as an individual, you have to pursue God, and you have to pursue that character so that you can self-govern. Because self-government outside of yourself, it requires self-government of yourself. If you do not have the responsibility, if you do not have the ideals and morals and value and foundation to do the right thing yourself, there is no world in which you can then tell the rest of the community or the city or the state or the country to also do the right thing. It's just impossible. And that's how we get to where we are now, that these laws that are being proposed now are trying to legislate morality from a different vantage point. And you hear that people say, this is a thing that they throw at you to say, well, laws aren't about morality. Of course they are. All laws are about morality because laws legislate the morality. That's the entire point. They legislate what you can do and what you can't do from a legal perspective, and thereby from a moral perspective. The morality of what you can and can't do, that just is morality. And the laws that the government is trying to pass is trying to say this is the morality that you must live by. That is entirely the point. You can believe the best in people. You can think that if you leave people alone and let them do whatever they want to do, they will always choose the right thing. But Romans tells us, Paul in Romans and Jesus in another place tells us that we are all sinners and we are all prone to sin. Even the hymn writer, which I love, said we are prone to wander. We don't go in the way that we're supposed to go. The law of God and the law of the land help us to know what's out of line, and when we go out of line, to provide justice to whomever breaks the law. That's very important. Whomever. It's not if you're rich and powerful and you break the law, you get to get away with it. That is not justice. That is injustice. And justice is supposed to be blind. Justice is pictured with a blindfold, because it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or powerful or weak. The law should apply equally. Now we're getting to a point where we're legislating things that are not equal. They're based on things like race, they're based on things like power, and it's not blind. And that's actually a problem, because then at some given point, if you're on the wrong side of the power structure, then justice is not blind and it comes down harder, or vice versa. And that is how you get tyranny of government and other just bad forms of government that are not good for all the people in a society. And again, have we gotten this 100% right the whole time? No, we have had a lot of trouble in America, but we'll get back to that in a moment, because the point is, we have spent many years, many amendments, and we have this process that helps us get better with the foundation of the Ten Commandments and the foundation of the rule of law that allows us to know what is outside of ourselves and know what the morality is supposed to be. And then when we don't live up to that, we can change laws through the process that we have in place. Now we're not doing that. We're going about it in different ways. And the idea also that I want to bring up is that, and this idea that laws are outside of morality. No, laws do legislate morality. And all governments in the history of the world have had a connection with religion, the separation of church and state. Religion is connected to morality, and it thereby is connected to laws, because the laws legislate morality. And governments in the history of the world have had connection with religion, because all humans are innately religious. Everyone worships something. Even in the founding, it was stated that we are to worship the Creator God, so that morality would have a firm foundation. The Creator was written in the Declaration of Independence, and 10 Commandments were displayed in courtrooms for much of American history. In the Declaration, you have this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. These rights and laws, and the laws that protect these rights, are from God, and they're rooted in a biblical worldview. So the reason that we need to talk about this today is that religion is under attack in America, and specifically Christianity is under attack in America. The point of American government is supposed to be upholding the rights, upholding the laws, and it's supposed to be like the pledge says, with liberty and justice for all. And we talked about justice being blind. The very reason justice is blind is so that the money and the rich and the powerful don't get preferential treatment. And that's how we're able to go back and use the system and change the law. And we've seen many amendments giving women and minorities the right to vote and freedom and all these other things. And yeah, it should have been there in the beginning. But it couldn't be there at the beginning of the country because of the society at large. And you can't judge history based on the future where you are. You can't, because the way things change through time is the way that they change. The fact of the matter is, even the founders saw a lot of the things that were happening in America before it was even a country were not correct. That's why there was an American Revolution. That's why a country was started. That's why they broke from Europe and from England, so that we could create this place. Even the very first Puritans said they wanted to create a city on a hill. They wanted to create a community that didn't have the oppression of people like some of the places they literally escaped from in Europe. And we were able to defeat slavery, and we were able to give rights to minorities, and we can continue in that process. But there are many now that are claiming we just need to tear it all down and replace it with question mark. I don't know, and that's part of the problem. But what I want to hone in on is this idea of Christianity and religious persecution, because we're going to talk about America, Canada, and England. Those three places have been, at some point in time, the forefront of Western civilization as far as freedom and as far as allowing people the opportunity to have this idea of freedom. I think America has been at the forefront of that. I unfortunately don't think we're at the forefront of that anymore, but there are other places like Canada and England that are cracking down even more. So there are things that are happening to churches as governments grow increasingly more bold with their secular morality. because the government now creates its own morality. That's what we were talking about. There is no absence of religion. There is no way to remove religion from the world. It's just not possible to do that. And what happens then is some religion, something has to take the place of Christianity, and I believe that it has. It's this new secular moralism or secular scientism. There's a bunch of different things that are in various categories, but always point to the same thing, that we can choose our morality based on whatever, the loudest voice or the most powerful person in the room or just the mob. But the reality is we're seeing this across America, England, and Canada, and the government is saying, as a church, and saying to the church, you must obey the government or else. So in America, here's just a couple of examples that have just happened in the past few weeks. We have had calls from the government to use the IRS to punish religious organizations that don't comply with cultural values. And the organizations are going against these cultural values and just trying to have biblical values. And so here's what we're seeing. Here's just a couple of examples. You have the nonprofit group called Christians Engaged that was just recently denied their tax exempt status because, here's the reason, they used the Bible. Yeah, you heard that right. So the fact that the Bible is something that they reference as a group called literally Christians Engaged, Christians who use the Bible because they're Christians, are now denied being a nonprofit because they use the Bible. But here's the important reason, and the reason that we need to talk about this. Let me just get the quote for you here. They argued that, quote, Christians Engaged, this is the organization, was not eligible for 501c3 status because Bible teachings are typically affiliated with Republican Party and candidates, end quote. So now, according to the government of the United States of America, enforced by the IRS through tax codes, and I mean, again, finances affect reality, they affect life. So now it says the Bible is expressly a political document and expressly a Republican document. Obviously, that's ridiculous. The Bible predates Republicans, and the Bible predates any of our government, in point of fact. But the government of America, the United States government, has now stated through its enforcement of this IRS rule that the Bible is a Republican document. And I would not be surprised if this type of thing goes forward. And again, this is just a nonprofit group, so this is not a church. But the reason they got called out is they were using the Bible to illustrate certain ideas and certain values and certain policies, and whether they align with biblical values or not. And this is my whole point, right? The point is, if you align with biblical values, then you are not in parallel, you are against the culture. The biblical values are against the culture, and more so as we're moving through this time. And the problem here is, if you are against the culture, and now the laws are based on the culture and not on morality, what we've understood for 2,000 years as right and wrong, now you are against the culture, and the government is beginning to use the tools that it has, like taxes and the IRS, to enforce the fact that you, as a follower of God or as a Bible reader or Bible believer, Bible practicer, now you are against the culture, and the government is going to enforce that through the means that it has. And this is not the only place that we've seen this type of thing happen. And the reason that I bring Canada and England into this is they are connected. I know it's not the same country, I know it's not the same government, but if something happens in England, if something happens in Canada, it is quite likely the same type of thing can happen here, because as you just saw through the G7 summit, like, the leaders of all of those countries are very much aligned in terms of ideology. And the ideology here is the important thing, because again, this country used to be based on this idea of Judeo-Christian values and worldview, and now it is not. And so the fact that it is not, they have to come up with something else. There is a religion, there is a worldview that will inform and direct decisions that these governments are all making. And they, after watching some of these summit things, are very much aligned in terms of the directions that they're going. So when you see a country like Canada arresting multiple pastors like Pastor Pavlovsky and Pastor Tim Stevens and Pastor James Coates over the past several months, they've been arrested and taken away. And I believe at this time, I just checked a couple days ago, but I believe Pastor Stevens is still in jail. And his big crime was having church. His big crime was having church. And the reason is he's breaking coronavirus edicts and lockdown orders and things like that. But Costco is still open. It never closed. Home Depot is still open. It never closed. You can go ride a train. You can go ride a plane. You can do all of these other things. But going to church is a problem. And even Pastor Pavlovsky has mentioned that, and I checked, I could not find a single infraction or like Pastor Coates. He still cannot go to his church. He has now been released from jail, but he was in for more than a month. But his church is still fenced off. He can't even go to his church, even if he wanted to open it. That is not a free expression of religion. Again, I know America and Canada have different laws and rules and values, but they have been, before now, closely aligned ideologically. And I would say they still are closely aligned. They just have moved in a different direction than they used to be. So my point with Pastor Pavlovsky, he has pointed out, and I checked, and you can send me if you've seen it, but I have not seen a single mosque closed. I have not seen a single imam or religious Muslim leader arrested, and yet they're still meeting. And Ramadan just happened, and I know that thousands of people gathered in certain areas in Canada for Ramadan, and great. Fine. Again, the free expression of religion should allow them to do that. I'm not calling down on them for meeting. I'm saying, but then if you're going to arrest Christian pastors who have, tens, if not a couple hundred people, and that's not appropriate. Again, there is no standard, and it appears that the standard is Christianity, and the standard is we can't let these Christians gather, and that is a problem. It is a problem that we have to keep in mind. And I've mentioned some things in England that have happened before. We won't get into more of those today, but there's just, you have to understand that there were principles that were used to found this country of America. And similar principles came out of England. Similar principles went into Canada. And we've been operating out of those principles for decades. And yet now, the powers that be, I'll just say that, are clearly not operating from that place. And they're operating from a place that makes this a different type of situation, especially for Christians. And so this is something we have to monitor. And if you think this cannot happen in America, it can. And these IRS issues are point in fact that the government is trying to do things. And if you lived in California, or if you lived in New York, or some of the other places around the country that were locked down, that, I lived in California for much of the lockdown of the previous year, where you were not allowed to go to church. You could not attend a church. It wasn't based on your own personal responsibility. It wasn't based on something that you could choose, your own risk. The same as every risk, right? You choose when you drive your car, whether you can take the risk of driving your car. You choose when you get on a plane, whether you take the risk of getting on a plane. I was in a lightning storm the other night, legitimately in a lightning storm the other night. And I chose to, go across the parking lot and take care of some things. And I didn't die, but I chose to go across when lightning was striking. And people should have the freedom to choose whether they want to enter into worship or not. And this is an even bigger issue than driving. If you took away my driving, I would be really frustrated. But I don't have a religious right to drive. Now, there are some freedom concepts, and I think it would be ridiculous if you did that. But as is illustrated in many, many stories through the scriptures, Daniel, for instance, I'm thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I won't get into them all. But we have to have the ability to worship, because that is what is called from God for us to do. And the fact that the governments of many of these countries, including America, Canada, England, and many others, are now saying, no, we have the right to tell you whether you get to worship or not, is a problem. And we have to keep an eye on this. And so, fortunately, there is some pushback at this point. Fortunately, many of the states in America have begun to open up, though there are still some rules in certain areas. There is a senator, U.S. Senator Josh Hawley. He is standing up for those in Canada who are being persecuted from a religious standpoint. Again, I know these are different countries, different governments, all that kind of thing, but he wrote a great letter. You can search it online. You can check it out. To urge the government to allow religious freedom that they have had for most of the country's history until now. And here's the bottom line. Countries in the West, America, England, Canada, all at one time were founded on these Judeo-Christian roots. They've had different levels of religious freedom, but they have had a biblical worldview and biblical governance based on morality found in the Bible. And in the vacuum of no foundation, no morality, make your own morality, as we've covered many, many times on this podcast. When you make your own morality, when you make your own laws, when you make your laws based on whoever is the most powerful, the loudest person, inevitably those conflict and crash together, or the government has to tyrannically enforce the laws because they don't make sense ideologically and they go against just the very nature of who we are. And there are people that argue that we don't have an inherent nature, good or bad or whatever, or we're just all good, and if the government got out of the way and the systems got out of the way, then we would just float around on unicorns and everyone would, it would be rainbows and amazing. It's just not true, and history bears that out. It's not just philosophy, it's not just ideology, it's not just this brainiac thinking. You can just look at history and see when sources of power have been in a vacuum, other sources come in, and generally those that are the loudest, most powerful, or mob-like do not end well. Just look at history and don't even take my word for it on that. So when we remove God from these situations, which we clearly have done at this point, and when we remove the idea of the image of God and these other voices that are talking do not have the same values based on God's image of each individual person. Instead, we make laws and choices based on whoever they decide to benefit. And usually whoever they decide to benefit is the loudest person or the strongest person or the most powerful person. And so now we're following these other social things and or the mob, which is bad. And whichever way this happens, it never ends well for those that are persecuted. Now, I am not worried for the church. The church has, in fact, survived much worse than this. I just want the most people to find Jesus. That is ultimately and always my bottom line. The most people, I would love to hear about the good news of God. And it is, I guess my point is that it's just going to be harder and harder and harder to do that with the culture, with the government, with all of these organizations, with the academy and education, with Hollywood and everybody else pushing down on Christianity and saying it's just not okay to have a biblical worldview. With more religious persecution, we're going to see the rise of more of this secular religion. And as believers, here's my point for you. As believers, you are going to have to grab the courage from wherever you can get it. I would suggest getting it from God, to stand under the big pressures of this world that are saying what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is invalid, what you're doing is hateful. You're going to have to find the courage to stand in the middle of that and stand into the prevailing wind of culture that is going against you, probably with more and more force as we go through this time. And I'll just leave with this and say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, just as Joshua said so many years ago. So I hope you will also keep the faith. God bless.